All right. Welcome, everybody, to our initial panel of 2024. Today is going to be a VC vision into what's happening in climate tech markets, specifically in the early stage. We're really excited to have three panelists today. We have Shanice from Clock Tower Technology Ventures. We've got Atlas from Mission One Capital, and we've got Leo from Voyager Ventures. I'm not going to introduce them now because they're going to do that shortly. But I'm Alex Katzmann. I'm one of the founding partners at Growth Inflection. Myself and my partner, Stefan Laengin, are going to be moderating this session. Got 45 minutes slotted for it. We highly encourage your participation in the chat. Please drop comments. If you have questions as we're going, we'd love to see them, and we'll try and work those in. Just before we get started, a little bit about why we wanted to do this panel. Obviously, there have been a lot of changes over the last couple of years in the venture funding kind of capital markets. There's also the Inflation Reduction Act hitting in 2024 in a big way. So we see this year really as being quite dynamic and driving a lot of momentum into the solutions that we need to scale to have the outcomes that we want for climate. So with that, I'm going to hand over to the panelists now. We'll start with Shanice. Maybe just give a quick personal background, something fun about you, and what are the main areas that you focus on in the climate space?
Cool. Thanks, Alex. And really excited to be here today. I'm Shanice. I spearhead our climate investment practice at Clock Tower Ventures, where we're investing in companies that are mitigating climate change, helping us adapt to a warmer world, or enabling the transition to net zero. So we invest across both hardware and software from pre-seed to Series A. Something fun about me, I probably have the highest spice tolerance out of everybody I know. I'm open to challenges, and part of that is because I grew up in Indonesia and Singapore, and there's a lot of spice there.
Awesome. Well, spice is always fun, and we'll see if we can keep the panel a little spicy today. All right, over to you, Atlas.
Awesome. I personally hate spice. That's funny. No, I'm joking. No, good to meet everybody. I'm at Mission One Capital. I'm the founder, managing partner here, and we focus on early stage software forward climate tech. I'm sure we'll get into kind of the software hardware discussion later in the panel, but yeah, my background, to give a brief background, came from the software space. I was a generalist investor for a number of years, ran a family office for a large rock band that you guys have heard of, Linkin Park, and was a banker. Don't fault me, when I started my career, and have been an operator as well. So, but yeah, so I think what's really interesting about Mission One Capital, I'll just point out, is that we invest in the US and in Europe. And so, we really see that as one of our value adds to our portfolio, is that we have this kind of knowledge transfer across the pond. We could see what's happening in the Nordics and how that then impacts adoption in Europe and how that will look in the US, for example. And then we really focus on the mind-body state kind of for high-performance founders. And that kind of goes into my one thing, I guess that makes me kind of interesting, or people don't know, is that I'm a vegan triathlete. I do Ironman distance, and so it's pretty intense. I have one coming up in May, right after I finish this half marathon at the end of this week. At the end of this month, I have a half marathon, but then I'll get back into the triathlete training. And then you asked about like kind of areas that we really like. I guess I kind of think about it, we're climate generalists, I would say, but I look at it in themes. So, things like, what I want the world to look like. So energy being abundant and close to free, so what are the things that enable that? AI, which we'll get into as well, being a great unlock for carbon reduction, especially in archaic industrial processes, for example, which we'll get into, I'm sure. Corporates having made a lot of announcements and now needing to get to facilitate action. And so, what companies are able to do that. And same on the consumer side. A lot of them really want to transition to more renewable options, but how do we enable that and give them more incentives and reasons to do so? So
great. Well, thanks, Atlas. And vegan triathlete, I didn't know that. That's very interesting. All right, over to you, Leo.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me, Alex and Stefan. My name's Leo. I live in San Francisco. I'm director at Voyager Ventures. We are a climate tech fund. Our team has over, I'd say, probably 50 years of climate experience combined between all of us. I've been in climate my whole career, since 2006. Mechanical engineer by background, got my PhD in Boston at MIT, focused on thermofluids, and then was at McKinsey for a number of years, advising clients on where to allocate capital in the sustainable landscape. Left McKinsey to go join a fund called Global Founders Capital, or as a partner, and led their global climate tech practice, and then ultimately decided to join a climate tech specialist fund. At Voyager, we are a pre-seed to Series A. I think I already mentioned that fund. We're investing out of a $100 million fund one. We have a $100 million opportunity fund as well. We do software and hardware. I'm a mechanical engineer, so naturally I'm prone to atoms versus bits, but I've done bits investments in the past, and we definitely need software solutions as well. We are particularly focused on hard to abate sectors, but also do investments across grid, et cetera. We'll get into more, I'm sure. Fun fact, I guess, if Atlas brought out the musical one, when I'm not raising my two kids or reading or working, I play guitar, have been for many years, and opened for Imagine Dragons a long time ago when I was growing up in Las Vegas. So sort of my 15 seconds of fame, I suppose. Well, I get another 45 minutes on this call. That's my additional fame. But anyways, back to you, Alex. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Well, exciting mix here. We've got some interests, besides climate tech, ranging from culinary to music, and to training for triathlons. So that's great stuff. Well, we're gonna jump through a bunch of different questions here. I think it'll be an interesting discussion. We're gonna keep it interactive. Wanted to start with a question that I'll ask to each of you, which is, how do you see 2024 differing from last year? And we know venture markets across the board were down last year, but what are you excited about, and do you have any concerns about this year going forward? And maybe we'll start with Atlas.
Me? Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, I think to your point, and we were talking off camera about how startups have to really think about the current landscape from a venture standpoint, and kind of the reset and where multiples are as they look to tap the market. But I think, just generally speaking, what I'm excited about from a climate tech standpoint specifically, are a couple of things. I mean, you mentioned the IRA tax credits and rebates, they're finally getting kind of trickling down to the state level, having more clarity. So the math for things like home electrification are starting to pencil out, hopefully, and then and we'll see kind of what that looks like once it's actually implemented. I think another thing that was surprising in 2022, 2023 was that all these manufacturing plants and large scale projects were announced. And I think now 2024, hopefully we get to the point where they're now operational. So flipping from announcements to actually seeing what comes online will be great, especially when it comes to some of those larger facilities. As they come online, those become new potential customers and clients of our portfolio companies. And so I'm excited about that, especially in things like, battery manufacturing, where, a lot of that was happening in places like China. And now we're seeing some of that onshoring happening in the US, for example. So I'm excited about that. I think one last thing I'll say I'm excited about is EV adoption. We just saw, maybe you guys just saw the note about Hertz. So maybe there's like the pros and cons and the bumpiness of EV adoption that's happening here. But I think overall, from a global standpoint, we're passing that kind of niche niche point of the adoption curve, and we're getting to the mass adoption. And so, Tesla Model Y being the top selling car globally is definitely a good sign. I have one, I love it. Although I don't think I was the target market girl dad who doesn't want to buy the minivan. But I think I think that's a good sign when you're seeing EVs actually go head to head against traditional gas vehicles in places like Norway, where they'll probably, sell their last ICE vehicle this year. And so I think that's just EV adoption in general. So those are some exciting areas. I'm sure there's a lot more. But you talked about concerning areas. If I were to think of one, in addition to like the landscape in general from a venture standpoint, I think if you step out a little bit more in the US, obviously it's an election year. And so, when we talk about some of the regulatory policies that are really tailwinds for the climate tech ecosystem, any uncertainty around where that might go going forward is definitely something I put in the concerning bucket. So, yeah.
Yep. Oh, makes sense. Well, let's hear from Shanice. What are your thoughts on this year?
Yeah, the market dynamics that we're paying close attention to is sort of this dichotomy between there existing a huge amount of dry powder in climate tech, but at the same time, investors being more cautious to deploy those dollars. So that's both a concern and a positive because at the early stages as an investor, we're starting to see more price discipline with the pre-seed seed rounds. But it also means that startups that are starting to scale now have greater availability of growth capital potentially available to them given these mega fundraisers that we've seen and funds raising opportunity funds as well, like Leo mentioned. Aside from that, like what I'm super excited about, we're exploring a few themes around distributed energy resources, grid tech, but also to Atlas's point around EVs, and specifically for us, EV charging infrastructure, and which parts of that are appropriate for venture to be funding. The other thing is just the amazing talent that we see flowing into climate every day. So I open my LinkedIn and it's either a fresh grad or an experienced operator now looking to enter climate, and that just provides tremendous momentum and excitement. On the flip side, not necessarily a concern, but just something we're thinking about more is a lot of the climate techs that raised in 2019 and 2020 are now hitting their graduation into Series A's and Series B's. So I'm just curious to see how many of them will be able to successfully graduate into those larger growth rounds.
Yep, absolutely. I think the whole electrification space, and especially like charging infrastructure, there's a lot of challenges there, but at the same point, a lot of opportunities. And excited to dig in on some of the future questions. All right, well, we will go to you next, Leo.
Yeah, I mean, agree largely with everything that Shanice and Atlas shared. The VC market obviously normalizing after the 2021, 2022 frenzy. But the positives are that in this PwC report, climate tech has actually had a growing share of that muted market. So in 2013, climate tech investments were about 1.5%, and by 2023 it had climbed up almost linearly to 10%. So we climate tech, I suppose, we're capturing share from other sectors and bringing in more generalist investors that aren't just necessarily climate. That said, completely agree with Shanice. There are a lot of startups that are going to be going for Series A, Series B, and would recommend that they just be prepared, closely monitor burn, operate leanly, clearly define investor and customer milestones that are required to hit that next fundraising round, and having conversations with investors very early. That said, the dry powder for these startups, people talk about a valley of death at the Series A, Series B. There are sort of Series C plus investors and a lot of pre-seed to Series A investors like us, but at the B maybe, or at the A, there's a little bit less. But what I see filling the gap is new funds and new equity funds in the space, but also like DCVC's, Series B, but also a lot of new funds that are coming up for non-dilutive financing. So I see off-balance sheet financing from emerging funds that are trying to specifically do first of a kind or early infrastructure debt. And I think we're going to start to see those funds emerging this year. Additional tailwinds, I want to make sure to cover other ones. The IRA, of course, the impact of the IRA, but if the Fed cuts interest rates, that's going to be very helpful. If momentum builds in M&A and IPOs, that's going to be great. 2024 election, if we continue to support sensible industrial policy in the form of decarbonization, that would be spectacular. I'm excited about, in the COP28, there were methane commitments that were made. So we're looking at methane reduction and removal, large language model AI. We continue to look at the use of AI. We'll talk about that in very specific instances, and just the continued focus on industrial and hard to abate sector decarbonization. So yeah, it's a very exciting time indeed.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're going to dive into a lot of the points that got made, and I think specifically for founders on here, we will have a part at the end around advice for raising, and specifically to what Leo called out the challenges around Series A and that stage. But I think Stefan, over to you for the next question. You're on mute.
Typical comment. Thank you, Alex. My question is regarding the Inflation Reduction Act. So the funding actually landed I think in December, and will land in January, February on a state level and needs to be spent within the next 12 months. How do you see the influence of this injection about this money and on the dynamics of the market, and especially for climate tech startups, or also for your funding behavior? Shanice, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. Honestly, could not overstate the impact of the IRA in terms of catalyzing investor interest. So Leo mentioned, for example, generalist funds are starting to look at climate. That's because the $369 billion that the IRA is channeling over the next 10 years is so powerful that it's inducing a lot of other types of investors into climate tech. I was actually chatting with someone from the LPO yesterday, the Loan Programs Office, that's part of the Department of Energy. And one thing that struck me in that conversation was how much government is keen to work together with the private markets to deploy these dollars in the most effective way. And that's something new. You don't often see government and private market participants talking to each other. And for VCs, when looking at the impact of the IRA, what that means is a bigger investable universe to me, because those dollars are being used to de-risk some of the technological pieces that usually we don't feel comfortable taking on. And so now we can invest in a broader range of business models that look much more economically viable in the short term because of this IRA boost. And an example is carbon capture with a 45Q tax credit. On the startup side, one interesting dynamic now is that it means a bigger TAM, a bigger market to play in, because the startup can now address markets that are growing at an accelerating rate. So Atlas mentioned earlier something around the scale of investment that the IRA is catalyzed. So I was looking at the numbers. It's over 200 clean energy projects worth $100 billion and creating almost 100K jobs. And this is just to date. It's not the full amount. And so with these TAMs expanding, it means bigger markets for startups that are building today, but also new opportunities that are going to be created.
I think to that point, I'll give an example with one of our companies, and you mentioned EV infrastructure, right? So it's a new company called Charter Help. You guys probably know them. They focus on EV infrastructure. They're really kind of an insurance product for infrastructure owners. And so they monitor charging stations, and then they actually fix them either over the air, or if they need to roll a truck and actually do the fixing with a technician, they'll do that as well. But to your point about TAMs increasing, I mean, as the EV infrastructure kind of footprint grows, so does their TAM and their opportunity as well. And so it becomes like the IRA, we always like to say we invest in companies that can compete and really be competitive unto themselves, but the IRA may create another kind of environment where you can factor that into your investment process like confidently, because you actually know how it's going to play out a little bit more than as before in 23, 22, we were kind of like, what does that mean really from a standpoint?
I like Jay's question. Hey, Jay, as well on startups. You're right. A lot of the IRA dollars seem like they go to the larger companies, but I'd say, what Atlas said is true too. The IRA being there gives comfort to help underwrite investments for startups. And as I understand, it's not a finite resource. These are tax credits that all the startups can apply for, right? So in the case of one particular startup that I backed at GFC, that does bioenergy carbon capture sequestration, that 45Q is key for helping them produce electricity, but then also earn, up to $85 per ton for carbon storage. And, the way the language is written, plus bipartisan support for 45Q in particular, we felt very comfortable that they would be able to access that. So you're right that we still have yet to see the early stage startups tapping it greatly, but I have faith that by the time they get to scale, they'll be able to tap it, as I don't think it's a finite pool of capital. The startups can apply for those credits.
No, I agree, and then we have talks on a state level with commissioners, and they are all open to really listen now to these kind of new concepts and startup approaches, because there's pressure from the money from the state to really take care about it, and I think that's open new opportunities and will land at the end also at startups and will support them. Regarding underserved communities, and if we talk about energy saving and energy efficiency, and then in most cases you talked about a Tesla, in most cases are kind of there more kind of middle class and above people who can really take part of this movement and be energy efficient. If you have difficulties to bring food at the table, then it is difficult to really kind of spend money for it and also invest. Do you think this will change in 24, and what kind of areas in the climate tech space and startups can really make this happen? What kind of concepts can make this happen? Atlas, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. I think there's been a lot of conversation about, how do you make sure the transition is equitable? Mentioned, as we go, as things like home electrification, how's the math, as you say, for the underserved communities that have trouble kind of financing that type of opportunity. And obviously there's some companies like the Block Powers of the world, for example, who are trying to address that from an electrification specifically standpoint. But I think one of the areas that I think is kind of interesting from like a maybe underlooked area or an opportunity for startups or founders to really think about are green jobs. I think there's going to be, like Shanice mentioned, there are 100K jobs today already available. And so people need to get trained up to actually understand how to fill those jobs, right? And so there's one kind of angle on the training piece and the kind of education piece, but I think what's also really interesting is that, for example, in Europe, we invested in a solar developer or installer that specifically built their business model around addressing the fact that there's a labor shortage when it comes to actually do the installations. And so I think like the business model is actually building in a way to actually train up and then like put new talent to work immediately is really interesting. And then in the US, I mean, it's never been a better time to be an electrician, right? I think there's a massive electrician shortage as well for the same reason. Demand is outstripping the supply of electricians right now to do things like EV charging, installation in homes and induction stoves and heat pumps and all these kind of things. And so not just on the training side, but I think if you were to kind of look at green jobs more holistically, there's things like, routing jobs and orders to specific electricians. Maybe there's a CRM play there. Maybe there's a payment layer to be thought about in terms of, the transactions that are taking place, as well as the financing around the DERs that are getting installed themselves. Maybe there's a marketplace play there. So I think like if you think green jobs more holistically and think past just the education or skill piece from a startup founder standpoint, there's a lot of different layers of the pie that could be attacked as well. I think that are kind of looked right now.
Just want to jump in with a couple more points too. Those are great points, Atlas. I'd say the reason why this is not clean tech 1.0 all over again is that costs have come down, in some cases even more so than predicted for solar, for batteries, for EVs. It's been incredible, and so now we're not looking at consumer and corporate altruism. We're looking at superior unit economics for the green alternative. And in some cases, pretty smart innovation around maybe not needing a contractor to come in. For instance, I'll be very specific. We invested in a company at Voyager called Channing Street Copper, and it's an induction stove with an oven and a battery, and you can actually plug it into a 120-volt outlet instead of a 240. And so, sometimes innovations can allow you to make the cost of switching green cheaper. And that's both at the consumer level, but also at the corporate level. But since the question is specifically about consumers, one more point here is that the IRA has provisions. I think it's in the chat as well, and I think my panelists here, co-panelists, have alluded to it. But the IRA, I think, has specific provisions around home electrification and EVs with a salary cap. And so, I think they're there specifically to help, struggling families or folks that are, folks that are struggling a bit in this inflation environment, to go green.
Jumping off of that, actually, the second thing that the IRA does to contribute to an equitable transition is for the facilities that are being set up for clean energy, they've actually baked in additional tax credits that you can only access if you're building in a low-income community and creating jobs there. So that's another lever from a policy perspective. A couple of additional thoughts with similar themes to Atlas and Leo. But an obvious one in my mind is in nature-based carbon solutions. If you think of where the carbon sinks naturally exist today, they're often in rural or remote areas with communities that are underserved. So if there are business models that are better able to share those benefits, it can actually be pretty powerful in uplifting a community. And I see that in Indonesia. I was biased because I was previously working on a startup idea in the space, but that's one. And in the second one, around the idea of making the green transition less punitive to low-income communities, is in the mitigation of climate risk. So you often see insurance premiums disproportionately affecting people of certain income brackets. And so being able to reduce the climate risk, I think, in a meaningful systems level way would help reduce some of that burden on them to pay for higher insurance premiums. And there's so many data ways to play this. We're invested in a company called Earth Force, for example, which undertakes better forest management to reduce wildfire risk. But if the knock-on impact of such a technology is meaningful, then it will lead to that compression of green premiums that can help lift a lot of different communities.
Great. Well, I think there's a lot in IRA, and I think we could use like another whole hour to go into that. But I wanted to transition to another very of the moment topic, which is AI. And obviously, this is a very hot topic in venture in general, and just, there's a lot of new technology. But what do you see happening in AI that around climate tech? And is this actually an accelerator for climate tech, or is this mostly just noise? And I know, Leo, you've got some strong views on this topic, so maybe we'll kick this one off with you.
Yeah. I think most folks would probably agree with my perspectives here, but the advent of large language models was a step change to how we were doing machine learning and AI before. It's all of my friends that work in AI, be it at OpenAI or Toyota Research Labs, they all had to sort of shift their focus towards LLMs once they came out. It it is a step change, and we're going to continue to see the way it reverberates through climate tech, but also just business in general and the way we live our lives. Specifically for climate tech, I'd say, though, it's an accelerant in specific cases. It's not going to, for certain companies in my portfolio, for instance, a bit of AI might improve efficiencies a bit, but it's really, we have the engineering know-how. We just need to build it. It's execution. It's AI doesn't come in. But there are a few instances in which it makes sense, right? So I'll list a few. One, predicting extreme weather. There are a few startups that are doing this to monitoring deforestation. Using satellite imagery, AI allows us to do things that we weren't able to do before with respect to more accuracy in terms of that GIS data. Optimizing renewables, and that includes batteries as well. So AI allowing us to have better arbitrage for battery storage control, for instance. That includes managing power grids as well. Number 4, tracking emissions. There are some startups in our own portfolio at Voyager, like Carbon Chain, that tap into AI for emissions baselining. You can't manage what you can't measure, right? Number 5, guiding carbon sequestration. Number 6, one I'm particularly interested in, and I'll come back to it in a moment, but designing materials. Number 7, improving agriculture. 8, optimizing logistics, and 9, enabling smart cities. I want to go back to designing materials, though, for a moment. I think there's a real opportunity in AI to, we've been reading about AI coming up with new battery materials, right? Or perhaps proteins for use in mining, or even for use in, maybe designing new microbes or proteins for crop adaptation, finding crops that are drought resistant or salt resistant. And I think that's a very exciting space. Now, whether, AI for battery materials is venture backable, there are definitely some companies doing it. What I can say is the hard part comes after you find the electrolyte of the materials, which is scaling up these multi-billion-dollar gigascale factories. And so that's only step 1. But I think it does, AI does allow us to explore new biological molecules and new chemical ones that can do things that previously science was very difficult for us to get there in the lab or through fundamental research. So that's one I've got my eye on in particular, whether it's for designing vaccines for cows to reduce their methane emissions, or proteins for maybe separating out critical minerals. That's something that we're looking at. So it's an exciting space.
Yeah,
there are a lot of applications. Go ahead, Atlas.
Yeah, I agree with you. And you kind of touched on some of these things, earlier as well, Leo. It's like, I think AI is an accelerant, especially when it comes to these archaic, like industrial processes. There's vast amounts of data that's being kicked off a lot of these machines that just aren't optimized, haven't optimized for efficiency, aren't queryable, aren't gleaning insights, et cetera. Actually, funny side story. I'm reading this book now called The Hank Show, and it's about this guy named Hank Asher. I don't know if you guys have heard of this guy, but a lot of the government institutions use his software. Essentially, what he did, he started off with old DMV license data. Basically, in the late 90s, he went around and actually bought all these data sets, right? So he started with DMV license data, then he went and bought kind of, credit rating data, then purchase history, then addresses, and then he all started making it queryable. Fast forward from the late 90s, 2001, or 9/11 happens, and he's able to find the terrorists in minutes or days rather than months, right? And helping kind of the government agencies do that. So I think, with this guy, Hank Asher, he was a, ex-drug smuggler turned data savant. So it's a really interesting story, needs a movie. But obviously talk about like founder market fit. But I think the idea is really around, archaic industries pulling data sets and then being able to glean insights. And so when you talked about, Leo talked about batteries, one of the companies we invested in is actually taking AI to help with that battery manufacturing process. So now along the stage of the process, there's all these different inputs, heat and chemistry, et cetera, and being able to kind of like correlate where in the process maybe led to impurities or scrap at the end of the process that didn't meet performance metrics, and be able to create like a feedback loop using AI is something that they're doing. And I think AI really comes into play there. Same thing with steel. And we invest in a company called Deep Meta that does the same thing. And they're looking at steel heating and rolling processes and looking to reduce the amount of energy that's needed for steel production. So imagine, I mean, steel, if it were a country, it'd be like the fourth largest country by GDP, I think. And so 5 to 10% energy efficiency and something like that is billions of dollars. Same thing in the commercial real estate space. We invested in a company that's using AI to ingest large, thousands of buildings at a time, and kind of spit out retrofit plans at scale for REITs that have large, 1,000 portfolio commercial buildings that they have to deal with, rather than doing it on a building by building basis, for example. So I think AI really can help with a lot of those processes.
Yeah. There's no example I can share that hasn't been touched on by Leo and Atlas, so I won't repeat them. But the point I just wanted to double click on is what Atlas mentioned about AI being an accelerant. So from my perspective, accelerating the transition to net zero is not transformative in itself, but can be transformative at a systems level to meeting our emissions targets. Like anything that we can do to speed up the rate of change will make a big difference on whether we achieve those goals. So that's my TLDR take.
Yeah.
Great. Well, I think we've got a few more questions, and obviously never enough time to do all of these, but I think one I wanted to jump to next, and it ties into a question that Dan and the audience had as well, is around advice for founders. And Leo, you had mentioned this, that Series A rounds, there aren't as many investors as there are in seed, and potentially like later stage once you get to Series C. You also kind of see it in the data that seed has maintained its activity level, but Series A dropped off quite a bit. So for startups that are looking to raise at A's, B's, maybe even earlier, what's going to make or break their chances this year? And then to Dan's point, how does this differ for a software only company versus a very capital intensive business if they're doing carbon removal or fusion or some of these other much more complex things? And we will kick this one off with Leo.
Sure. I thank you. I mentioned a few earlier, right? And I've given this advice to founders in my own portfolio. But monitor your burn, right? There's one reason why a startup goes out of business: it runs out of money. Usually that's the big one. So monitor your burn, make sure your runway is adequate. Try and start having discussions with investors 12 months out. You don't have to officially be kicking off a round. You can just get to know the investors before you do kick off that round. And if the traction is great, you can get a preempt, that can happen too. So talk to the investors early. If you've got current investors, you work with them to understand what milestones you think other investors will want to see, work towards those milestones, be very deliberate in prioritizing which milestones there are. I mean, sometimes there's a lot of things that one can do, but really it's 3 or 4 that are going to make or break the next round. And you want to be very targeted on those, whether it's commercial de-risking or technical de-risking. The difference, I'd say, between software and hardware, and I know some folks don't like that binary software hardware, but I find it's useful to think that way. And then there's startups that mix both. If you're IoT, you've got hardware and software, right? But just thinking about purely software companies, you're going to have a different set of milestones that investors are going to be looking for. They're probably going to be revenue based. They're probably going to want to look at your CAC and LTV and all those KPIs that VCs have been using for a long time to assess whether a startup's doing well or not. And sometimes there's even like specific numbers that VCs are looking for by the Series A, right? Alongside those KPIs, right? For hardware, by the time you get to Series A, you might not be seeing any revenue until Series B, but you might have a pilot that's demonstrated a certain amount of performance that allows you to understand, allows you to extrapolate without needing to reach too far, that the unit economics are superior for your particular product to go to market. And so it'll give investors a lot of comfort. Maybe it's also a pilot with a letter of interest from a particular customer with teeth. The LOIs with teeth are the best. Something that says, come test this out. If it's a paid pilot, even better. If it works and these milestones are met, we will buy this. We will pay for this. We will bring this on to X amount of our plants, right? So if you're hardware, think about that. Start thinking about project finance. Sometimes with project finance, and I'll wrap up in a moment to let my other co-investors pitch in, right? But if you're a hardware startup and you're around the A and the B, project finance is something you're going to be thinking about. And sometimes that not only means knowing who the project finance providers are, but also your team composition. Sometimes those project finance partners want to know that you've got a CFO or some kind of a controller that understands infrastructure. And so your team composition can be important. And there's a set of milestones as well that you're going to need for project finance, right? Do you have a reputable EPC? Have you demonstrated this at a pilot scale, right? And being very deliberate about what scales you're choosing for pilot and commercial. And all these things are very important, and it takes time and work with your seed investors to develop these materials and get ready. But I think despite all the maybe doom and gloom and maybe some of the the pain points I've illustrated, there are a lot of tailwinds in climate, and I think we're gonna see a lot of great startups make that leap from seed to Series A to B.
Go ahead, Shanice.
Plus one to everything Leo said, I just want to add 3 tactical pieces of advice. The first is, especially at the Series A stage, if you're raising from or you're trying to pitch to investors with a wide variety of backgrounds, you might be pitching to generalists, you might be pitching to climate hardware specialists or climate generalists. I would say have different levels of the deck that you prepare and present, because your audience's understanding of the deck will vary quite widely, especially if you're raising in hardware. And so whether that means adding appendix slides or just tailoring the first 2 or 3 narrative slides to that audience, that can actually make a big difference in how well your pitch goes. The second thing I'd say for software climate tech, theoretically with SaaS, once you have built the product, you can scale infinitely at minimal variable cost. But often when we see these growth assumptions of SaaS climate tech, they're a little bit disconnected from the reality of the underlying hardware markets that they're trying to serve. So if you're building a DER management software and you're going to sell to DER providers or utilities, matching your growth assumptions to a reasonable growth assumption for the market will just add more credibility rather than trying to say this is what software could scale to. Well, it's not disconnected from that underlying. The third thing is when raising in hardware, and Leo mentioned this already, but laying out that financing strategy is key. There's already so much information available online, and what types of projects that project financiers, first of a kind financiers are looking to back. So a more granular plan, especially at Series B, around exactly which capital providers you seek to target, what are they looking for, and how that works in a complementary way to your VC raise is extremely important.
That's great. I won't add too much on what has already been said. I think it was great. I should take some notes there for my portfolio. But I think that now in this new environment, and we were talking a little bit off camera about this, but if in 21 and 22 you had raised a lot of money because the market was up and everyone was hyped up to give you money at a large valuation, now it's time to show and prove. And I'm speaking from a software standpoint, but now you have to grow into that valuation. You have to show traction. You have to show real ARR. At the earlier stage where we invest, let's say seed, you don't need to necessarily be profitable, but some people like to see path to profitability there. But it also depends on the story and what you're exactly trying to build. So I'd say that depends, I would say. But then I think if you're just starting out, and Leo kind of mentioned this before, first of all, be realistic about valuations and don't look at 2021 and 22 to set your benchmarks on where you think valuations might be. I would say stay as lean as possible, and kind of really have a use of funds for 12 to 18 months or so, and then identify, like Leo mentioned, very specific KPIs that you plan to use as your success metrics, and then like weave those specific KPIs into the story on how you communicate, why they're important and how these set of KPIs are going to lay the foundation for what's a longer kind of growth story, or growth trajectory. And so I think that was something that I've been coaching a lot of my portfolio around, is like, what are the KPIs that are really going to tell that broader story? Rather than trying to, again, like you're trying to tell us a story that we want to hear, or, tell us actually the vision that you guys are going to create. And so that tension between the two is obviously, what we're trying to balance there with all our recommendations. But I think, but yeah, everything that has already been said is really great.
Thank you. That's really valuable insights, and will help startup founders who are currently watching us. I have this is our last question, right, Alex? I'm not
Yeah, I
really
think
sure.
we're at the
I
end here,
think
so one
we
more.
should yeah. I have a question, kind of, if you see kind of the last year and the investments you took in climate tech startups, are there kind of learnings, positive or negative, you might share, Shazan? You maybe?
Yeah,
Yeah.
lots of learning every day. I seem to be learning at an increasing rate. I don't know if that's good or bad. But on the positive side, I think a learning is that a well-constructed cap table is key in the early days. Rather than going for just a couple of big brand names to take a full round, in climate, we see a lot of collaboration. We see small value-added checks, whether from smaller funds or angels, that can be value additive as you're building in very complex systems. So that's just something we're thinking about helping founders with, and founders are more intentional about, and that's worked out pretty well in climate. On the negative side, I don't know if this is controversial, but I still feel like there's a lot of groupthink and FOMO in climate. So we often see these micro hype cycles. For example, in a space like green hydrogen production, which we might be less excited about today, but we see lots of other investors funding into it, and we feel like we need to adhere to our discipline, but it's actually a lot harder than expected to separate signal from noise and keep that discipline. So that's a learning. And I think just a symptom of market frost that we saw earlier that hopefully is coming down now.
Yeah, I mean, I'll definitely agree with that. I think that like areas like, mobility and carbon markets, for example, have been very sexy. But a lot of the stuff that I've been seeing, there's been a lot of overlap in terms of the ideas, right? So, finding unique patches within these markets, I think is becoming harder to some extent, because I think a lot of the hard things have been tried already that already failed, or, there's already market leaders in certain areas. And so, I would say even in climate tech, there's almost like a climate tech 1.0 after clean tech, then there's like a climate tech 1.0 where we saw a lot of, initial concepts get out the gate. And then now you have to kind of go a couple layers deeper to really find the opportunities, I think, from a founder standpoint. So that's one thing. And then the other thing, as a primarily software investor, like Leo just mentioned, maybe you have IoT and maybe see your software layer on top of commoditized hardware, for example. But hardware is hard. And I think that especially in this high rate environment, making the math work on financing, even if it be debt financing, et cetera, is very difficult. And so when you're creating your models, like really think about how the CapEx needs you're going to need for a company are going to play out, in a rate environment like where we are. Obviously, things are trending down, so we can all, be happy about that for sure. But I think until that happens and plays out into the credit market, that's going to be challenging, I think.
Yeah, agree with all the points. Agree with all the points here. learnings, both positive and negative. I'm trying to think of some that are different, but because I agree with both my co-panelists. Negative, it never had an impact, inshallah, on my portfolio, but definitely would encourage founders to engage with investors, potential investors, well ahead of needing to raise. You are in a stronger position when you're not, saying we need 5 million, but you're in a stronger position when you can say we're not raising around for another 6 months, but wanted to get in touch because we like what you do, we like your portfolio, and we're not raising right now, right? And developing the relationship with investors so that they can see you over time, and it's not just hey, we've opened our round, here's the data room, and just developing the relationship with the investors that you want on your cap table ahead of the next round. And then I'd say on the positive side, learnings, I'd say agree with Atlas. There's, it's hard to do another carbon accounting startup right now. There's a lot of them out there, right? And so it's hard to do another, I don't know, another carbon offset trading platform / integrator now. It's like sort of saturated. And so for me, the positive learning has been really fun to find the new areas that are popping up. What are the exciting areas where there's innovation headroom to disrupt these antiquated industries, be it copper or lithium, or that's just mining, but in steel and cement, and to see the creativity of some of the technologies that are coming in. I still get to learn every day new approaches to I've been digging into mining a bit these days, so I'll just give an example, like new approaches to copper extraction that are wildly different than what we've been doing for the past 100 years. It's pretty cool. So and trying to see whether, trying to put on my crystal ball and see, hey, can this actually scale and change the way that we supply minerals and metals for the energy transition. So it's really fun. It's really fun to see the new crop emerging, and what comes out of the labs and the universities and what comes out of founders' minds.
Great. Well, thank you, Shanice, Atlas, and Leo. This has been a great discussion. I feel like, I have lots more questions. Maybe we'll have to do a follow-up at some point, but and appreciate all of the audience questions and comments. Great session here today. You can obviously find what Clock Tower, Voyager, and Mission One Capital are doing on their websites, dig in their portfolios. If you're curious what Stefan and I are doing at Growth Inflection, put the link here in the chat. We're going to be hosting more events as we go forward. You'll find out about that on LinkedIn. So again, thanks everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Meeting, guys.
Bye-bye.